Hey everyone, our Shawn McBride with you, joined by my regular co-host Deirdra Watson for another Best in Events. And we got Chris Gerhart as our guest today. He's in the events production world. He's going to help us talk about how to make the most out of virtual events. And I think one thing that's great about Chris and his background is he's actually been doing virtual events for several years. So a lot of people made an immediate shift for obvious reasons here in the last several months. But Chris has been around it a bit more. So he's got some of the mix of, in-person versus virtual and what we can do to really kick our virtual events up to the next level. So Chris, why don't you say hi to everybody and give us a little background on you? And then I know Deirdra and I've got a few questions we'd love to ask you.
Perfect. Yeah. Hi guys. Chris Gerhart. My company's Crescent Event Productions. We've been in the live events industry I've been in the live events industry for going on probably 16, 17 years now. We've been supporting customers with virtual events for many of those years as well. The last several years, we've been, had customers moving in, things like live streams and trying to find more engaging ways to manage that element of their event. And obviously with this pandemic situation we find ourselves in, we along with the rest of the masses, I guess we had maybe a leg up on that process. Had gotten started on a little bit sooner, but we've been pushing ourselves and our customers into more and more of a virtual environment and had quite a bit of success doing it. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today.
Yeah, so I'd be curious, just what's the initial reaction? For the people who've been forced to go from an in-person event to a virtual event, what are they saying about the virtual technology and what's kind of like the real first test looking like for people?
Yeah, I mean, there's, the initial conversation when you start talking about pivot from live to virtual is what do you want that to look like? And I think a lot of people approach it from a standpoint of taking a webinar and trying to add maybe enhancements to make it feel a little bit more event-like. And what we've actually done is approach it a little bit differently. We've started with the notion of a live event and how do we incorporate as many elements of that into a virtual environment as possible. And I think that distinction in our thinking has lent itself to the platform that we've found a lot of success with. But, when you get the conversation started, it's as simple as what technological platform are we going to run on? What, hardware infrastructure do we need to make that happen? How are we going to support, X number of attendees and how do we want to engage with them? Do we want it to be, how produced do we want it to be? Do we want to just send them a Zoom link at the start of the day, or do we want to actually have them engage with us in a number of different mediums along the way? What if sponsorship's a key revenue piece of your event? How do we incorporate sponsors? There's a lot of just kind of brainstorming that goes into the initial conversation, and then we can start to hone in on the platforms that support their needs the best.
Yeah. And so, how's that conversation going? Because I think one thing Deirdra and I talked about, one of our prior guests here on the Best of Events show, is kind of the idea of how do you mix, your needs with the virtual platform. And I guess a lot of people just aren't familiar with what's out there, right? What platforms are available. So how do you take people through that conversation?
Yeah. What we've been doing is starting with, let's talk about what your goals would have been for a live event. Let's talk about how that process, that attendee experience would have been, and whether they've done a live event before. I mean, there's not too many people that I'm seeing that had not done events previously and are saying, well, let's just jump into virtual. I think it's the big shift we're seeing here is people who have a need to communicate with their tribe, have a need to communicate with their audience, and are now lacking the live in-person experience opportunities. So they're having to figure out how to pivot. So we start with, what did the event look like before? And then how can we foster those opportunities throughout a virtual experience? So things like, what does your registration process look like? What does your attendee check-in process look like? How do you, when somebody comes to that registration desk, there's an interpersonal experience that happens there. Even if that's not somebody that the attendee is going to interact with at any other point throughout the event, that's their first face to the event. So how does that process work to still deliver a meaningful and engaging opportunity for the attendee to interact with somebody, make them feel welcomed? In the case of virtual, walk through any potential technological issues that could be, present. We do all that stuff in advance of the start of our actual virtual event, so that when the virtual event kicks off, we're ready to hit the ground running and everybody's kind of worked through any technical issues they may have on their home computer end or anything of that nature. So we start with that, then we talk through. One of the things I like to get to right up front is what is the monetization model for an event, right? Events take place in order to generate a revenue stream somewhere. So what's the monetization model of the event? Is it sponsor dollars? Is it ticket sales? What is it? Let's figure that out. And then we start to tailor the solution that we're going to deliver for a client, with that in mind.
So when I'm doing an event, Chris, one of my biggest factors with with my clients, because I'm from the beginning to the end, and I work with them on the budget, is their overall ROI, which is their return on investment. And then they look at, okay, the sponsorship dollars on top of that, and anything else like that. So what do you recommend? At what stage do you recommend at this point looking at a supplier of virtual events? Is it, because generally when I'm working with a client, I'll source my venue first before they can even look at the dates of their conference. We've got to make sure that we've got a venue in place, and then we can build from there. That's generally how I've done it in the past. We look at the budget at the same time, but where's that venue going to be? So, right now we don't have any venues. So would I come to you first and say, okay, this is, as you said, this is what my event looked like before. Now I've got to move to a virtual platform.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I think that, I mean, it's, I guess the disadvantage and the advantage of where we're at right now is you don't need to worry about venue sourcing, which there's a lot of savings to be had, in that regard. And we're finding, on a handful of case study examples recently, we're finding that the ROI that our customers are seeing is actually increased as a result of going virtual, in twofold. Both, a couple of case studies we've had, revenue was up, gross revenue was up, and because of no venue costs were significantly reduced. But yeah, I think involving the virtual event partner early on in the process is key, because it can be as simple as webinar style. Let me send you a link at the start of the event. And if your ROI if you can realize the ROI you're seeking out of the event through that simple of a platform, your costs can stay, significantly reduced. You can still deliver amazing content to your attendees through that medium. But if you want to start to incorporate things like sponsors, you want to start to incorporate a more enhanced networking opportunities and engaging experiences for the attendees, then I think you need to start thinking through a platform to manage that whole process. One of the things that we've been doing a lot recently is portal development for customers, where they can engage with, instead of getting an email the day that the event starts saying, hey, click this link and enter our meeting, and we'll kind of, you'll get the content that way. It's instead, we set up an entire process by which they register for the event. They go through a check-in process. They do through a tech check. And then on the day of the event, they get an email that says, come to the portal. They go to the portal, and on that portal, there's a sponsor homepage. There's enter the general session now. And all these things are just linked to different services that are available on the back end. I mean, some of them are proprietary that we've been developing. Some of them are as simple as, linking participants together using Zoom's platform. I mean, there's a mixture of packaged purchase products that we're using to support our customers. And there's also some proprietary stuff we've been doing and developing along the way. But when it's all intermixed together through a super easy to navigate portal, it creates an easy opportunity for the attendees to engage with the content you're delivering, which, if sponsors are a significant portion of that revenue piece, or if ticket sales are a portion of that revenue, whatever the case is, to make that experience as easy for the end user as possible is going to help garner a greater ROI in the end. For us, what we've been really focused on is creating as frictionless of an experience for the attendee as possible. Knowing that if you're live at an event, any point that you see friction in the process, you can go to a help desk, you can go get help somewhere, and somebody can guide you through that. And virtually, you can kind of get left, to the wolves if your platform's not working, if you're not getting access to what you want, when you want, where you want. You could be missing a huge portion of your audience who's out there, lost in cyberspace and ends up on Googling your competitor's name instead, right? So for us to keep everybody engaged in one central platform where we can deliver, access to sponsors, access to other attendees, access to resources, media, the live event, all of that through one central platform has created a pretty seamless and frictionless experience for the attendees.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's in many ways it's a parallel experience, but it's also radically different, right? So, from a budget standpoint, you don't have the venue cost, but now you've got a platform cost, and now you possibly have different relationship with your sponsors. So you've really got to build this thing. I guess that's why you're saying you come in early, because you've got to envision what this looks like and tweak all the revenue streams and make everything fit together nicely.
Right, because you might have different tracks for your event, and within those tracks, there's a whole bunch of different sessions.
Yep, and that's all stuff that is managed through the proper implementation of the portal concept that I was talking about. That's all automated. So when people register for an event with us, for example, one of our customers, they'll select whether they're going to go to X, Y, or Z tracks in advance. Some of those tracks could be pre-day events where there's an added fee to attend them, things of that nature. All of that stuff is then managed through a database platform on the back end, that when that attendee comes into the portal on the first day of the event, certain buttons are active for one attendee that may not be active for another, based on what they've registered for, based on what they paid for. Certain links are active for everybody. For example, the sponsor link, we want everybody to have access to our sponsors and be able to go visit and interact with them. So yeah, what we've tried to do is take that live event element where everybody's experience is unique. And where oftentimes the serendipitous hallway conversations that take place are as valuable as the content delivered on stage, and still foster all of those different mediums and angles for people to interact.
Yeah.
Can you, oh, sorry, go ahead, Shawn.
What have you seen as far as kind of recreating some of that? Because I mean, I do think that's one of the biggest things for me at a conference is, you know, just the random people you meet, right? You go to a networking hour and you talk to somebody, or you're in the hallway and you bump into somebody, or you're sitting in a chair, you're skipping a session because you're busy with something and you're typing away on your computer. Somebody comes, sits down next to you. I mean, what can you do to kind of bridge some of those gaps?
Yeah, so that's actually where one of the things I mentioned right up front is that the core platform that we have the attendees engage on, it's a web portal that we build out, but it links on the back end to Zoom. So we're using Zoom as a hosting platform, and one of Zoom's great features is the breakout feature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And regular Zoom meetings, the breakout functionality allows you to parse attendees into small groups for all different kinds of purposes. So we've had a lot of success getting small networking. So we didn't use breakouts from like the traditional sense of the word breakout, where you would, you know, put 50 people into a breakout meeting and they would present on a certain topic, and 50 people over here on a different topic. And instead, we use the breakout functions to parse people into 3 to 4 or 5 person groups and give them a networking prompt at the start of that time. And then give them some free time just to chat and get to know one another. And I can tell you that, again, on the few case studies we've had recently, since the pivot has gone entirely to virtual, there's no opportunity for the live event to take place right now. We've seen the feedback on that portion of the event has been tremendous. In fact, at the very last one we ran, we had requests from attendees to double. We had some built-in kind of free time throughout the day, thinking folks are going to get tired of just staring at their screen all day long. Right. And we actually had a request to open up that networking time to those free times as well, so that if they didn't want to be on a computer, they could walk away. But if they wanted to engage further, they could. We had that request just come at the end of the very first lunch break of day one. And so we shifted the schedule for the rest of the event to allow for a lot more of that one-on-one networking, or, you know, small group networking. And the feedback from that was tremendous.
So can you give us an idea of how you would deal, for example, with say like the CEO keynote?
Certainly. Yeah, so there's a couple angles on that. One, I'm actually sitting right now on our studio space in Charlotte, North Carolina. I mean, if you have the ability to get a camera crew and all that kind of equipment in front of them, that can add a lot of value to it. But you don't necessarily need that in order to bring in remote presenters. So what we've been doing, again, from an attendee perspective, is using Zoom as a platform to bring them together. We also have a couple of other software packages that we've got, software and hardware configurations, that allow us to bring in high bandwidth, high resolution remote presenters to deliver their content. We've taken a few elements of the remote presenter experience and enhanced them. For example, we've got as simple as a web app interface for a smart device that allows you to drive your own slides from an iPhone or an Android device. So you can it's almost like having the remote clicker in your hand. So the slides actually reside on a computer in our studio space. Even if a presenter is not here, the slides are running off a computer in our studio space, which allows us to ensure high quality streaming out to the end users. Because if you ever tried to do a screen share on Zoom, you know that the bandwidth, the bit rate, everything kind of falls apart in the quality. If you were going to play a video, for example, off of screen share in Zoom, it doesn't come through with great clarity. And there's a lot of video solutions that we're using to bring in remote presenters that's still a limitation of those. So what we've done is we've taken all those content delivery pieces, keynotes, PowerPoints, things like that, put them on a computer here in our office, in our studio space, and then allowed the remote presenter to drive their own content through some simple integrations that we built.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think it really streamlines and cleans things up. I think what's interesting too is now, so of course we all know that a lot of events have been forced to try virtual, right? So because of this situation we're in, events that we're having live are going virtual, and people have really no choice. So what do you think this does to the long-term trajectory of the industry, Chris, now that people have done more virtual events? They've been forced to try it. Of course, some of these kinks are being worked out. Audiences are getting used to it. Where are we in 6 months, a year, 5 years from now? What do you think the future of events looks like now that we've had this experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the 6 month mark is, I mean, I think that largely it's going to follow some of the curves of the pandemic itself, right? I think that there's a hunger for people to get back to face-to-face live human interaction. No question on that. I mean, you see that just around the United States with protests because people feel too shuttered in place and things of that nature. So I do think live events have a long-term place. There's no question about that. I also think that there's an ROI model to support virtual events in the very long run. For some groups, I mean, again, just the handful of case studies we have out of our studio space here, folks are realizing greater ROI, greater revenue on less expense, obviously greater ROI overall, but not just greater ROI as a percentage scale, literally more physical dollars in the bank at the end of their event. So I think virtual has a component that's going to last well beyond this pandemic. I think the 6 month mark, you're going to see events, live events coming back around on small scales and regionally and things of that nature. I think 18 months from now, if the industry wanted to, could probably be back almost to where it was. I mean, obviously there's a lot of, I'm not a doctor. There's a lot of medical elements that factor into that. But I think that 18 to 24 months, say, whenever there's vaccines and herd immunity and all these other things, live events will come back to being a thing. But I think that even as that happens, when you talk about that interim, that 6 month, the 12 month or 18 month mark, you're going to see a massive shift in live events to minimizing, allowing for social distancing, minimizing some of those, close quarter interactions. I mean, we've got fall events. We're talking to customers, live events for the fall. We're talking to customers about, setting 4 people to a 6 foot round so that everybody maintains, all on different sides of the table for 6 foot social distancing. Well, you do that, you just slash the numbers of people who can attend that general session.
That's right.
So now you have to start thinking through, well, do we have overflow rooms to handle more physical attendees? Do we just cap our registration and then move everybody else into a virtual platform? If we do that, do we keep our ticket prices where they were? Do we drop them? I think that's largely dependent upon your revenue model for the event. I would make the argument that if you're still delivering the same content and somebody doesn't have to pay for hotel and travel and food and all the other, costs that go along with attending a live event, that if your content delivery is the same and you're delivering a meaningful message to your audience, then I don't know why you would have to adjust ticket prices per se. But no question that even 24 months, 48 months from now, 10 years from now, there will be a virtual component that lives well beyond this pandemic that's going to be far more developed and far more robust than it was 6 months ago.
Yeah, and I think Deirdra and I both have kind of, obviously a lot of us enjoy the in-person element, just that shaking the hands, actually physically seeing the person, seeing their full reaction, just things you can't fully recreate online. But I'm with you. I think the fact that people are forced to test this stuff is going to mean some of it's going to stick around, right? It's going to start getting mixed in new ways.
I agree. I think there's a long-term element to consider. And one of the things that we have, it's a bit of a question mark in the ROI model we've seen from the strictly virtual platforms that we've run in the more recent weeks, is right now most of the world's under some form of a lockdown. So when they're no longer, are you going to hold the same level of engagement? I mean, we had an event not too long ago that was supposed to be a 300-person live event. It shifted over the course of about 2 weeks to an 800-person virtual event. It ran for 3 days. They had 300 people registered for the live event. They ended up with about 1,000 registered for their virtual event. They held 800 consistently. I think largely that 800 was because they were delivering incredible content. Just the feedback from the attendees who, the virtual feedback through the chat systems and whatnot from the attendees was tremendous. But I also think there's an element of these folks they can't go other places. They can't do other things. So if you typically would have had your kid out at a baseball field in the afternoon on a Saturday or go to this live event, well, if you went to the live event, you're there, right? You've paid your flight, you've got your hotel, you're there. But if you're at home and you have the option, it's a lot of different angles as to how to pursue that. One of the things that we're seeing customers do is not offer replays, not offer on-demand replays of their videos so that you're forced to attend live if you want to get the experience or not. But there's going to be a lot of variables that come out of this that people have to consider based upon and again, I think it really comes back to what's their monetization model for the event.
One of the other questions that I wanted to ask you, and it is in regards to engagement, how, as a speaker, or working with a speaker or working with a specific program, how do you think that they should keep everyone engaged? Because we know that you can do death by PowerPoint, but here you are, you're in a virtual situation, and you might have the PowerPoint on one side of the screen and then the speaker on the other side of the screen. But how do you suggest that we keep those attendees engaged, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm done and I'm going to go and walk the dog and I'll come back later?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's largely based upon, like, literally the answer is the question. It's how you engage with those attendees. So part of the platform we've built is completely like the opposite of your typical webinar, right? So it's interactive in so many different ways. It's the ability for a presenter, whether they're in our studio space or remote, to actually call on an attendee. It's funny in some ways when if you're speaking live on a stage and you're looking at a sea of faces, you don't know any of those names. Well, because of some of the functionalities built into even platforms like Zoom, you can have the person's name at the sub little corner of their image.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can say, hey, I see Deirdra over here. I'd like to ask, Deirdra, I see your hand up. You've got a quick question. And then that can be brought up live with the proper technical backing. That can be brought up live for every other attendee to see, hear that interaction. I think the more that you can engage with the audience, the more you'll keep them engaged with your content. I also think it's basic kind of, even this goes back to live events. I guess almost think of it like when you're watching TV, right? If you're watching the nightly news, which I'm not sure I'd recommend these days, but if you're watching the nightly news, you seldom see the host leave a graph up too long or a graphic up too long. If anything, they'll call for it to come back if it gets taken away too early and they're still referencing it. I think keeping a lot of face-to-face time is important. Mm-hmm. And I think you can kind of pepper it with PowerPoints and things of that nature, videos. But I don't think that presenters want to be just delivering webinar content right now. Listen, at the end of the day, everybody's got competitors. And your competitors are out there communicating with an audience and they're doing it in an engaging way. So finding the way to stay most engaging with your audience is going to be critical in keeping them in your kind of corner.
Yeah. And I think, what do you do to set that up in the first place? I mean, I love that idea of interacting with the audience. One of the problems you often have at an online event is a lot of the attendees just log in and they turn their camera off or they go to mute, and they're just sitting out there quietly in the background. I mean, are there any tips or tricks to kind of make sure that everybody actually is prepared to be engaged?
Yeah. So from a standpoint of looking at it as two-way communication, from the presenter going out to the audience, we actually, like in the events we've been running, we actually manage what the audience sees. So we don't get a screen share from that presenter. We have the computer running there. They have their remote app allowing them to advance slides. And then we also have their camera feed coming in separately. So we're actually able to switch back and forth and follow the content and make sure, just like if you're at a live event when you'd see, image magnification on screen and then you'd switch over to PowerPoints. We do that back and forth so that we keep the flow of the event feeling engaging for the audience. The other thing we do at virtual, and I think it's no different than at a live event when you have, the voice of God announces so-and-so to the stage, they come up and give kind of a rundown of what the day is going to look like, and then they bring up the first presenter. We have an MC who hosts the virtual events and kind of walks people through what we're expecting out of them to get that engagement and allowing for how, the presenter feeds, the presenter's energy largely feeds off of what the audience does. So, hey guys, if you're out there on Zoom, fire up your camera. Let's see it. You'd ask that question and we had 800 attendees and you'd see 800 little, in our studio space, and I didn't mention this at the start, but in our studio space right here, I'm looking at 13 monitors that give me a great view of basically anything we want to have show. But what we typically would do is, the grid view of a lot of those Zoom calls there. So when a presenter would say, by show of hands, who's done X, Y, or Z, that presenter would see, 800 hands go in the air and give them that feedback that they're going on the right track with their content and keeping that audience engaged.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, let's see the graphic
cutting
behind
edge,
you.
man.
Yeah.
You're on the ball.
And then some of the stuff that we're building into this web app interface for the which I just mentioned, the PowerPoint advancer element of it, the slide advancer element of it, but is also the ability to send things back down that line. So it doesn't have to just run on a phone. It can run on an iPad. It can run on a computer. It's a responsive website, but we can send timer notes back down the line so you can see the time left in your session. We can actually send that grid view back down the line. So it's ways we're looking to support remote presenters better, even if they can't be at our studio space in Charlotte, to be able to get that live interactive feedback from their audience.
Yeah, it sounds like you got some really nice elements playing together there.
Yeah, looks cool.
Yeah, one of the real challenges, Chris, is, of course, from the event planner standpoint or person managing this, is they've got to get buy-in. And so, you have a tradition of having an in-person event. You have a tradition of everybody getting together. Kind of the ROI or value added is expected from prior years. if you're looking at hosting an event, you think, okay, I want to go virtual. How would you approach, a board of directors or a C-suite and say, hey, how do I get, what do you say to them that really drives home the ability to use a virtual event to get some similar results or different results than what you get in person?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple answers to that. One is, I think it goes back to what I said a minute ago, and that is that somebody's communicating with your audience. If you're not doing it, somebody is, right? So the idea of just taking a year off is really not a good, it's not an option I'd recommend to anybody, even if they don't hire us, even if I'm just consulting somebody, even if it's consulting with a friend and I'm just giving free advice. Don't take the year off. That's the worst thing you can do. Now, if your event was scheduled in the next couple months or next month or two, and you have to shift and you have to delay your messaging a little bit, that's one thing, but don't take the year off, because I mean, that's the first thing I would say to them is, if you're missing the messaging with your audience, somebody else isn't, and you're going to lose market share. But then I'd start to look at again, the goals of the ROI. And for me, in making that case to the C-suite or to the board of directors, I would talk about some of the case studies we've had where we've seen far greater attendee numbers. Again, 300 to 800. We've got one coming up. There's 2,000. Then when 2,000 live, we're expecting 3,400 virtual. So the numbers increase significantly. And that does one of two. It does a couple. Well, the numbers increase significantly in an audience perspective. Your cost to run the event, even if you use like our full virtual studio space here in Charlotte, there's still a fraction of what they would be with all the hotel costs and food and beverage and all these other elements. And even with portal development, all that stuff, it's still a fraction of what a live event would cost to run. And then because you've got such an increase in attendance, if you're charging by ticket price, you can either charge a lower ticket price and still realize your revenue goal. You could charge the same ticket price and realize the higher revenue goal. On the sponsor side, if sponsor revenue is a significant portion of how you're managing your costs on the event and realizing that ROI, I mean, we had because the way that the system, the platform, the portal is built. Every time somebody went to engage with a sponsor, that was tagged in the back end of our database. And at the end of the event, we could email those sponsors a comma separated value Excel file list of everybody who had engaged with them at the event. And for most sponsors, they go there and set up their exhibit booth and they have a fishbowl on the table and they're hoping to get 20 or 30 or 50 business cards coming out of that. We had 800 attendees at a virtual event that held consistent. We had 1,000 registered. We held 800 consistent. 450 to 500 leads were sent to every single sponsor at the end of that event.
Can you speak sorry to interrupt, Chris, can you speak a little bit about the engagement of sponsors, because they are used to having this 10 by 10 booth or a table, and now that they're in a virtual situation, how have you found that people are engaging with the sponsors? Is it click to a portal to go to the sponsor, or, do they see, I think we chatted when we spoke the other day about possible commercial for a sponsor. Like, what do you feel is the right way for a sponsor to get engagement?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that there's elements, obviously it depends on sponsorship packages that a group might be selling. If you're selling platinum sponsors versus gold versus all these different levels, that can influence how much access then they then are given through the portal or at the live meeting, maybe in the studio space or with commercials running or things of that nature. So there's a lot of different angles you can pursue there, but yeah, I mean, what we essentially did for the last couple is we'd have moments where the host is calling out the sponsors and talking about what they offer and how it can be valuable to the attendees experience, and just check them out. And they do it for every sponsor, so everybody's there. In that case, all the sponsors had an equal playing field, so everyone was given kind of equal attention in that regard. Again, if you have some platinum sponsors, maybe those are the ones who get called out, and some of the other sponsors who are on a lower tier, for lack of a better word, they're just referenced on the portal. But then when you're on the portal, you go to a sponsor page, and every sponsor has essentially their digital vendor booth, their digital 10 by 10 booth, if you will. They've got a blurb there of text of what they do, what they offer, maybe some photos, maybe some media links, if there's videos to support what their product is. If they have a physical product that you need to kind of see demoed, they might have demo videos. And then to manage the time throughout the event, we would actually push people into sponsor time, and they would engage with a certain sponsor they wanted to see, and that would actually launch, again, just another Zoom call that would allow that sponsor one-on-one time, or one-on however many time with the folks who showed up in their booth during that time frame. So what we would do in that case is we would encourage the sponsors to run relatively short presentations. They had about 40 minutes. Every time we did it at this last event, they had about 40 minutes of sponsor time at all the designated sponsor times. There were several points throughout the event, but every time we would do it, they'd have 40 minutes. And we would tell them to run their presentation for about 3 minutes and then have about 7 minutes of Q&A, almost as if they were a docent at a museum, right? So standing in front of a dinosaur exhibit, and here's my little 3-minute spiel on the dinosaurs, now ask me your questions, and then you move on to the next exhibit, or in this case, move on to another sponsor. But because of that, folks in that 40-minute window could engage with several of the sponsors. And if you came in late to a sponsor's virtual expo booth, you didn't have to stick around too long to get their messaging. And then, yeah, I mean, that was all tagged again on the back end. The sponsor would be in that Zoom call for that time. They'd get to engage with those folks who are coming to learn about their product or their offering. And then at the end of sponsor time, the Zoom meetings would shut off and everybody would come back to the general session and off we'd go.
It would be really interesting to get some statistical information from the sponsors on the results of the lead generation.
Certainly. Yeah, no, and we know, you know, kind of anecdotally that well, we know through conversation with the sponsors from these last few events that we've run that they were thrilled with the results in terms of lead generation. Anecdotally, we know that, you know, they would typically, well, put it this way, at the last event, each sponsor walked away with between 400 and 500, 450 and 500 leads. The live event, all those sponsors were all the same sponsors who would have been at the live event that we were planning on hosting.
Right.
There were only going to be 300 people at that live event. So if they had maxed out and gotten every single attendee's business card, every single attendee's contact information from the live event, they still would have not gotten as many viable leads as they got through the portal engagement. So there is data to support it. Obviously, a lot of this data is new and being tracked, and you know, engagement of say a sponsor hall in virtual. We've been doing stuff in the virtual realm for several years. Sponsors was a relatively new thing. We had done little bits and pieces where we would maybe feature sponsor promotional videos throughout virtual events in the past, but to have an actual virtual sponsor hall, exhibit hall, so to speak, that's relatively new in the game right now. And so the metrics are still forthcoming, but I mean, just anecdotally, we're seeing numbers that are definitely supporting it being a very viable option for sponsors.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a different model, right? So you're going to have a different type of connection, but the volume and the ability to track everybody that comes by, I mean, that's something you would kill for at a live event, right? I mean, because a lot of times
I think if you
pop
think
in
about
and they're gone.
And even if you think about, like, if you know, walking around an expo hall at an event you've been to, right, you're going to engage with an exhibitor for a few minutes and then move on to another one. Chances are that's not where you're actually going to sign the dotted line and make the sale, right? So what the sponsor then does with those leads is up to them, and the success they realize long-term and the monetization of that for them for the like ROI on their sponsor dollars. It's largely up to what they do with that. But, you know, as the event host, your job is to facilitate that opportunity for that engagement. And that's what you are charging the sponsor for. Hey, I've got all these attendees coming together for this purpose. You pay me money in order to get access to all my attendees. And if in that regard, this pivot to virtual has actually supported a significant uptick in those numbers.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So in some ways we have, you know, differences, and everybody's been concerned about it, but we're talking about now enhanced efficiencies, right? I mean, more tracking of the sponsors, better knowledge of that. And some of the tools you were talking about were very interesting. They you know, knowing the attendee's name when you ask them a question, you even get a little bit of background information on your attendee rather than just coldly interacting with somebody in the audience.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. So it's just a different way of thinking. Chris, you've been a wealth of information. You really know this world. How do people learn more about you, your company, and get in touch with you? I know you mentioned the Facebook page you guys have.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, visit us online, crescentevents.com, or come to our Facebook page, Crescent Event Productions, facebook.com/Crescent Event Productions. We'd love to support. And honestly, like right now, it's one of those kind of rising tide situations. If the tide rises, we all come up together, right? So if I can be a knowledge share to anybody along the way, I'd encourage them to reach out. It's not, you know, just chatting doesn't cost a dime, you know, and if we can offer support in seeing the entire industry both weather the storm and then pivot coming out of it into ultimately what is a long-term new normal that will incorporate a virtual component to events, I'd love to be a resource.
Well, thank you for being such a fantastic guest in the tradition of what we're building here at Best in Events. So everybody out there, make sure you're subscribed to the Best in Events YouTube channel. We're bringing you more programming like this. As always, pat yourself on the back for doing the hard work. Chris, thanks for being a fantastic guest. And we'll talk to you all again very soon.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Shawn.
Chris.